good evening again. Right. Welcome back. We're again on day 3 of the Shakespeare webinar to Double Business Bound, and we're on our last item on the program. And we're really saving this topic for the last part of the program. The past 2 days, we've been talking about the interplay between Shakespeare academia and performance, editing, adaptation, translation. And the question now is, how do all of these play within the classroom in the Philippine context? So I'd like to introduce our last speaker for the webinar, and that is Dr. Judy Celine Ick. Dr. Ick is a faculty member and currently the department chair of UP Diliman's Department of English and Comparative Literature. Dr. Ick's important scholarly work on Shakespeare in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, all published internationally, makes her one of Asia's top experts on Shakespeare studies. True to being double business bound, Dr. Ick is also an actor and dramaturg who has worked with local theater companies on both Shakespeare and non-Shakespeare projects, notably Screen Macbeth in 2011 and Richard III in 2018. Now, let me also introduce our moderator tonight who will help facilitate the conversation with Dr. Judy Ick, and that is Dr. Joachim Antonio. Dr. Joachim describes himself as a family man, teacher, and writer. He's currently the program director of the MA Humanities program at UANP and has earned his PhD in creative writing with the department, the ECL. To date, he has won 8 Palanca Awards for several plays, including The Last Filipino and Floret Road, and a couple of short stories for children. His work with Shakespeare is a true product of Double Business Bound as well, having created Compact Shakespeare, which he has used to teach Shakespeare through performance. Former program director of the MA Humanities program. Okay, so here to speak with us about teaching Shakespeare to Filipinos, please welcome Ma'am Judy Ick.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Okay, my talk today. Oh wait, I need Mikey, my other angel. There you go. Thank you, Mikey. My talk today will really just echo and perhaps summarize a lot of the points that have already been brought up by the prior speakers. I don't intend to lay out a pedagogical treatise or to present well-developed lesson plans or course guides. Instead, I'll just be sharing some tips and tricks I've accumulated in the 3 decades I've been teaching courses on Shakespeare at the tertiary level. What has worked for me and hopefully may be adjusted to something that can work for you too. Towards the end of my talk, I'll briefly address the online teaching of Shakespeare, as I noticed questions raised about that in the Q&A box in the previous sessions. Next slide, please. Let me begin in a very familiar place. Who doesn't know Sonnet 18? That was also for me a powerful moment of realization, a moment of profound crisis. I'm such a drama queen, but hear me out. This sonnet marks the point when I first fell in love with Shakespeare. In 5th grade, in Miss Fermin's English class in St. Paul's Pasig. And I fell in love precisely because of the language. I thought it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard, and I have been besotted ever since. We move forward in time some years later when I'm standing at a bus stop in the middle of a freezing below zero New England winter. At a rather desolate time, 4 p.m., when it was already dark when it was supposed to be light. Buses were scarce because it was the winter intersession. There were no students on campus, and I was on campus because I was preparing to defend my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, as soon as the spring session opened in a couple of weeks. I'd been standing there for about 20 minutes, freezing to the bone marrow, when I started bawling and just cried instantly out of nowhere. And it was because I had come to an existential crisis. I was so cold, and it hit me only then how I never truly understood Sonnet 18. I know my brain works weird ways, but that's what happened. Because when you're a Filipino, Sonnet 18, why would you compare yourself to a summer's day? I mean, what's so special about that? In fact, if you ask a Filipino about the summer's day, the image that comes to mind are those like 100-degree weather days when you have 3 electric fans on you and you're still sweating, right? It's not very glamorous at all. Or, thy eternal summer shall not fade. I'm like, yeah, of course not, because I live in eternal summer. So it was just that. It wasn't in my body. It wasn't in my bones. And I realized that I never understood and will never understand Shakespeare completely. I could study all I wanted, but I would never feel him in my bones, not instinctively anyway. What a thought to have 2 weeks away from a dissertation defense, right? Now, I'll stop the story there because I don't intend for this to turn into a very public Judy therapy session. Next slide, please. I began with that story about Sonnet 18 to illustrate an important point and the assumption upon which my entire Shakespeare career stands. While Shakespeare may be a global phenomenon, he is not universal. Okay? We cannot intuitively, completely understand Shakespeare. We only understand what we can, how we can, when we can. So there's no such thing as immediate mastery or just getting it. Sorry, no. Shakespeare's not universal, not in that way, okay, no matter what you've been told. Which isn't to say that the work isn't great or even accessible or important, but it does take a firm grasp of context in order to understand. And more importantly, context is a two-way street. Contexts of reception should not remain unexamined. We mistakenly think that giving historical backgrounds as teachers, for example, I will give the historical background of the English Renaissance, that ought to be enough to explain Shakespeare's work. But unless we examine how that compares to our here and now, our work is incomplete. Next slide, please. This brings me to my first tip. In order to teach Shakespeare, our primary job as teachers is to bring Shakespeare close. That means unlocking the language and resituating contexts. Next slide, please. Oddly enough, we're back in Sonnet 18. Okay. You'll see on the slide, on one side, I have Sonnet 18. On the other side, I have a modern poem that's based on Sonnet 18 by Howard Moss. This is an exercise I always give my students early each semester to drive home the point that while it may be initially difficult to unlock, Shakespeare lies in his language. Okay, so I give them this, and then I ask them, so are they the same poem? Initially, they will say, yes, ma'am, they're the same poem because they're saying the same thing. But once we start dissecting the poem, we go line by line and we talk about the imagery, the figurative language, how it makes you see, feel, smell, and it creates an entirely different experience. Okay, then they begin to sort of open up. I then tie this to performance conditions for Shakespeare's plays and point out how different they were from our modern conceptions of theater, and how the language was absolutely essential to creating the experience of the play. Language created magical forests, enchanted islands, battlefields, shipwrecks, where there was nothing on stage, nothing except words. This drives home the point that simply knowing the story is not the play itself. I tell them, if you only know the story, then you only know what Shakespeare plagiarized. You have to have the words. You have to have that created experience of the play. And if I do my job well, at this point, they're chucking out their copies. Goodbye, no fear, Shakespeare. And they commit to the language. Next slide, please. While understanding the language may be an important step, it is only the first. Here are other strategies to help examine contexts. With my students, I always subject Shakespeare's plays to what I call the Plausibility Test. Would or could the play have happened here as in the Philippines? Could it have happened here? Could it have happened now or in the past? What would be the same? What would be different? A quick example, say, for example, a play like Othello. Now, we know that Othello, its main conflict is, racial. It's the black youth topping the white ram, and the disgust, the racism that means in the Western world, right? But in our culture, I'm not saying we're not racist, but our experience of racism is different. And in fact, in our largely exogamous culture, I mean, Filipinos love to marry out. That's the reason we're such a mestizo race, right? Marrying a foreigner is not taboo. In fact, in some sectors of society, it's an aspiration, right? So we have a different sense of that. Maybe so. I talked to my students about this. So what's the trouble? What's difficult? What can't we understand? And actually, my students talk about maybe if it were here, it wouldn't be Othello's color, it would be his religion. So we begin to discuss what's different, what's the same. Maybe if it were here, people would be hate Iago more because Iago is just that person in the office who didn't get promoted and just creates intriga and chismis and just fake news to destroy someone. So we put it in context that way. Now, I raise this because the critical distance that is evoked by this kind of questioning ensures a deeper understanding and appreciation of the play, rather than trying to enforce the idea that Shakespeare was speaking to us from beyond the grave, that we were meant to understand this situation as universal, in the same way across time and space. That only turns students off, okay? Because they begin to feel they fail, that they don't understand, okay? And it creates distance, rather than what this questioning creates, which is critical distance, from which they can begin to understand the play more deeply. I also list on the slide other strategies there. Casting, for example, I love doing casting exercises with my students. I ask them, which actors do you see playing this role? And I always want to see the play that they're seeing in their heads. And I always ask them to cast with the foreign actors first, and then Filipino actors, and Tafniel becomes Romeo and Juliet or whatever. But it shows me that they're understanding character. Okay, they're seeing historical parallels. So it's kind of an interesting critical sort of play that you can do with the plays in the classroom. And then, of course, the old teacher trick of tapping into youth culture, talking to students, using materials in terms they understand. Luckily, in the field of Shakespeare, there's a wealth of material. I always start my sem now with Love Story by Taylor Swift or, some such thing. Next slide, please. Okay. All I'm saying is probably summarized in my next tip. Take an approach that is comparative rather than normative. Rather than insisting on a single authentic way of understanding the universal themes or values of a monolithic Shakespeare, it is far more rewarding to take the opposite tack and focus on difference or differences and understanding that there are multiple Shakespeares. Perhaps nothing illustrates this more completely than the nuances, to use Tracy's concept from yesterday, of performance, especially performances across cultures. Next slide, please. Performance, of course, is key to understanding the nuances of interpretation. There isn't only one way to do Shakespeare. There are many ways to do Shakespeare. I know many teachers use performance, but I'd like to advocate for watching comparatively in snippets rather than assigning a full movie. Because what I find is when you assign the student a full movie, Mel Gibson suddenly becomes Macbeth. Like they can't, they can't tell between the interpretation and the text. However, if you, as I do, for example, one of my exercises now is I give them 10 snippets of 10 actors, from Olivier to Cumberbatch to Andrew Scott to Brana, etc., all just doing the to be or not to be soliloquy. And then they begin to understand that there are nuances of performances, there are choices, there are differences, that the interpretations, there's several valid interpretations. And so their understanding of character becomes so much richer because of performance. Also, there are wonderful opportunities for cross-cultural comparison now with the digital archives available to us. It is, I've listed just a couple there. I forgot to put the links, but just Google them, the MIT Global Shakespeare's website or the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, if you are not familiar with these fantastic sites yet. It's amazing, just to look at the range and forms and languages Shakespeare exists in. And especially for us Filipinos who are somehow saddled by the fact that we can access Shakespeare in the English language, it's actually rather liberating to watch Shakespeare outside of English. Next slide, please. Now, all these comparisons would not be possible without the access afforded us by the internet, by the digital sphere in which Shakespeare thrives. And that's tip number 3, embrace the digital. Having been involved in Shakespeare in the digital humanities for a while pre-pandemic really helped me with facing the challenges of online teaching. In fact, if you work in Shakespeare, your problem will be the opposite of your colleagues, where they were all scrambling to create their own teaching materials and record their own lectures. My problem was choosing from the embarrassment of riches digital Shakespeare had to offer. I could have Sir Stanley Wells or Emma Smith lecturing to my students one day and have Stephen Greenblatt on the next. The choices are amazing and can get very confusing. I mean, just try wading through the 11.4 million hits you'll get on Google when you search for Shakespeare. Since there are questions about this previously, let me just share my top resources and adjustments to teaching Shakespeare online. As far as texts go, teaching resources, and some creative engagements with my students. Next slide, please. Okay, myshakespeare.com. This is the tech site that saved my online teaching life, and I can't sing its praises highly enough. This is a site that comes out of Stanford. Mikey, if you can just show them the site. I know there's a link, but is that going to be a problem? There you go. First thing, you can use this site. It's free, and it's going to be free for a while. I checked. Second, it's media rich. They're full text, not all the plays, but certainly the plays most commonly taught. And what I love about it is that it has a notebook tool that you can use for student work. Mikey, if you could just click on one of the plays so people just see what the text looks like. There, just click on any guy, on Midsummer or whatever. This is the problem with it. Here we go. Okay, this is what it looks like. And you'll see there are these little icons on the side. Like there's one for sound. So this is what Ricky and Michael were talking about, listening to the play while you're reading it. There are icons for performances, those theater hats, those theater masks there. You'll see performances. On the side, sorry, Mikey, where you were, there are little notes, okay, as well. Okay, so as they're reading, the students can just, if you click on something that says imagery, for example, just click on that. Let's see what comes up. There you go. This one explains Hippolyta, for example. So it's actually, it does a lot of my work for me. And what I love about it is that it has a notebook tool where the students can highlight and annotate their texts and submit their annotations to me. And then I see them reading the play. So it's been incredible. So, I mean, that's just an example. Of course, there are many, many other sites out there that can feature the work of Shakespeare. Can we go back to the next slide, Mikey? Yes, the next slide. No, that's the site. Slide. There we go. Yeah, there we go. Teaching resources. Okay. Where teaching resources are concerned, I stick to the big guns, and you'll see the big guns are linked on this page. I won't open them because that takes time, but please check them out on your own. The Globe Theater has an excellent teaching section where there are lots of free materials, lesson plans, and such. But unfortunately, except for snippets of videos, they require a subscription to the Globe Player if you want to watch the full plays. But you can still survive. There's still a lot of stuff out there that's free. And the virtual tour, I mean, if you haven't tried it yet, or make your students try the virtual tour of the Globe. It's not to be missed. The Folger has excellent sites, especially excellent resources for teaching in the time of COVID. So just check them out as well. The one I used for my class this past semesters has been the RSC. And the RSC education website, actually, I like it because they feature learning guides and teaching guides and learning guides for students that has many levels. so that the student can, choose to approach the text as a beginner, as an advanced learner, as an intermediate learner, as an advanced learner. So there are different levels of approaching the Shakespeare. And of course, because it's the RSC, there are lots and lots of performance photos. So I really enjoy that. Okay. Now, teaching online doesn't mean just, you change your teaching materials or adjust your teaching materials. You also adjust the way you ask your students to work with the texts because you're working digitally. And I just want to show two examples. Next slide, please. All right, because instead of giving exams and papers, traditional assignments, because we're working digitally, I've become far more visual in asking my students to do work. So for example, these are just some examples of work that my students have done. This is based on Act 3 of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where I asked them to post a picture or to look for a picture on Pinterest or wherever they want to that answers the question is, where do they sleep? Okay? To choose a character and imagine what the sleeping area or the bedroom of this person looks like and give it an explanation. And students are far better at expressing themselves visually than they are with words. And an assignment like this really empowers them. Next slide, please, Mikey. Here's another example. I asked them to look for two representations of Hamlet's mind before he meets the ghost and after he meets the ghost. And it's kind of interesting because my students tend to choose abstract art, or in one case, the one on the right, that's a student who drew this herself. I mean, they're actually more expressive in finding ways of picturing Hamlet's brain. And then they write brief explanations. So I'm just showing this to you because these are some of the ways I've adjusted myself to my classes to be more digital, to be more in keeping with the demands of online teaching. Okay. And next slide, please, Mikey. Okay, I started my talk with the story of tears, even as my talk's title promised no tears. This isn't exactly false advertising, as some of the tips I've shared have helped to make the teaching of Shakespeare far more enjoyable for me and my students. I hope this is the case for everyone else too. It is important that our Shakespeare classes are enjoyable and memorable, because the teaching and learning of Shakespeare is also the first step towards the owning of Shakespeare. We need to develop creative and critical students brave enough to contribute to the making of a truly Filipino brand of Shakespeare. In a funny way of returning, not just to tears, but to what I was saying earlier about the important role of context, specifically the context of reception, I end with this quote from Richard III. "The liquid drops of tears that you have shed shall come again, transformed to orient pearl." The quote comes from Richard's perverse wooing of Queen Elizabeth, convincing her to marry off her daughter to him after the death of his wife, Anne. That's the original context. But this might also resonate differently in the context of my talk today and gesture at how our own tears can transform into pearls. The path to teaching, learning, and ultimately owning Shakespeare can be hard, can sometimes involve tears, but it will also involve loads of laughter, tears of joy, and reward us with a depth of insight that hopefully fuels the creativity in all of us to craft a unique Shakespeare for our own country, our own Pearl of the Orient. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ma'am Judy. I'd like to ask Sir Dr. Joachim Antonio. We can start the open forum.
Yeah, it was such a, a wonderful talk. I really liked it, especially how everything comes together, from the past 3 days. In a way, as I was listening, there was a sort of flashback on the discussions on translation, cutting, performance, et cetera, et cetera. And I also really love the whole insight about Sonnet 18. I never really thought of the Sonnet 18 that way, and it really makes a strong point, and it's true, I think, because I mean, I think the way each country experiences summer is very, very different, and Shakespeare has a particular summer in mind. And I think it really helps. And I think really that emphasizes the whole context as a two-way street, right? In a way, we also have to, I mean, especially as teachers, we also have to think of the context of the reader. Na, yeah,
Yeah.
actually, there was one thing I did want to bring up, because it really struck me also. That was when mentioning that practice of showing different videos, videos of different actors performing the same soliloquy. There was a particular insight I had before when I was also teaching Shakespeare, which I don't know. I think it kind of is emphasized with that particular example of actors. I was wondering if it really, if it does help students to realize that the script that they're looking, written by Shakespeare's, really primarily written for the actors, not trusting that the actors will take care of the audience. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, is the script written for the actor, you mean? I mean, is that what you're asking, Joanne?
Does it help for the? Does it help for the students to realize, that the script was primarily written for the
Yeah, I think
actors?
it's important for the students to realize just that the scripts were meant to be performed in the first place, right?
Yeah,
That the act of reading it is a different act of reception altogether.
yeah,
And so it's kind of like, you point out where, like, one thing I love about Shakespeare, the stage directions are implanted in the line, so you have to point out and show how see the script is showing the actors what to do. I mean, this is exactly what Eileen was talking about earlier.
yes,
Yeah, and in fact, I kind of echo her, because, like, for me as an actor, for instance, I much enjoy much more working in Shakespeare, because the text tells me what to do. It's not like modern theater. You have to Stanislavski yourself into it and think of subtext, motivation, blah, 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 blah. Shakespeare, you don't need any of that. Everything is in the text. And that's why I insist on, like, students understanding the text, and that's why I say it's hard. Yeah, in the beginning, it's hard. But I also say to them, I promise you, at the end of the semester, it will not be as hard. You just have to put in the work. And I tell them I have to put in the work. It's not automatic for me. It can be, right? It can't be, because Sonnet 18, I just, it's not my experience, not my language. And now I'm not saying that we cannot identify. Of course we can,
mm,
right? But the ways in which we identify are very different and very unique.
mm. Um, Actually, I was
Okay.
also
And
wondering.
like I'm saying,
Sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
No,
Go
no,
ahead.
sorry. Yeah, yeah. Actually, I was also wondering, because sometimes I do encounter this very, very strange situation where a student would ask me, or tell me that I've never read any of Shakespeare's novels, and I was said, neither have I. but I think sometimes it helps also for students to realize that what they're reading is not a novel, even though the physical copy might look like one, but it's a script, right? It's a very different ball game, and the kind of thinking also helps, and I think um, in building that kind of confidence, wherein there's a lot of flexibility actually with regard to Shakespeare and the lines. I probably echoing what Eileen mentioned earlier, that um, yeah, I mean, it's not just simply a Juliet, but it has to be somebody's Juliet, and at the moment it's this particular student's Juliet. And I mean, I was wondering how to build that confidence with that students to be able to own particular characters when discussing in class.
Yeah, I think that connects to what I was saying about don't be incomplete in handling context.
Mm,
Okay. The key to the student owning the text, I think, or beginning to understand it, is not just to understand what's the same. Okay, Juliet's in love and I've been in love, therefore we're the same. That's incomplete.
mhm,
Because a 15-year-old, a 14-year-old girl in Verona in 16th century is not you.
mm,
So then you train them to think critically. What's the same? What's different? How is this experience of love? What does girlhood mean? I mean, all kinds of questions can come up in analysis that are worth talking about. And I think that makes, their understanding of the text better. Okay?
Mm.
That they're able to sort of see it both at a distance and yet up close, because it
Mm.
relates some way, somehow, to something in their lives. So it's really sort of balancing that and giving them that kind of confidence,
Mm.
right? Because confidence can only come from understanding.
Yeah.
And also, well, of course, the other thing that brings confidence is that you create your class. In your classroom, you make a safe space,
Yes.
and you create this idea that you can say anything in my class. I mean, that's
Mhm.
precisely why I start off with Shakespeare is not universal. You won't understand him unless you study. To say I need, and then I see students, they come without footnotes. And like, are you kidding me? I've PhD. I've been working in Shakespeare for 3 decades. I need footnotes. Why don't you have footnotes? Things like that. But just telling them that it's all right to question. Uh,
Yes.
my first activity, and those of you, I see some students here on the chat, they know this. My first introduce yourself lesson in class is, tell me when you lost your Shakespearean virginity. And everybody comes up with the story of the first time they ever heard about a thing called Shakespeare. And then
Mm.
I kind of just point out to all of them that they've all heard of him some way, somehow, from various institutions in various media. And then I asked them, okay, why are you taking my class then? And they're like, it's required. And I'm like, yeah, I know it's required, but why do you think it's required? And the answer inevitably comes up, that, oh, he's the greatest writer of all time. And then immediately I say, how can you say that? How many writers have you read? I cannot say that. I have not read all the writers who've ever written. I can't even say he's the greatest writer in English because I haven't read all the English writers who've written. And so they're like, but his plays are so important. I'm like, okay, how many here have read 37, 38 plays, 2 long narratives, 154 sonnets? And of course, my hand is up. And no one else is this. And then and then I go on. I say, okay, 35 plays, 30 plays, 20, 15, and there are no hands, right? Some
Mhm.
hands come up at 10, a few,
Mhm.
5, most hands come up at 0. And I say, okay, why is this happening? Why do you think he's the greatest? You've not read a thing. So, I mean, basically what I'm saying is that at the very beginning of class, I give them the power over Shakespeare
Mhm.
by showing them that all of these are constructs in their head that they've gotten from, all kinds of cultural educational institutions, parents, whatever, all kinds of authorities over them. So, I point that out because I think it's very important for them to feel authority over the Shakespeare. And when you sell Shakespeare as greatest writer, universal, speaks to me, and the student is bored out of her mind because she cannot understand what this thing is saying on the page, then the student feels inadequate.
Mm.
Right? The student then begins to feel, there's something wrong with me. I don't understand Shakespeare. I must be stupid. Then you have a problem. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to that point, Joanne, I think it's very important that you create that confidence in the student.
Yes.
Even if you have to question the institution, even I question my job basically. Yeah.
Yes. But
Because it's very strange. The class I teach at UP has been in the books in my university since 1912, right?
mm.
Only courses older than it are the introduction to lit, introduction to composition, and then Shakespeare. So it's been there for more than 100 years. Single author, I say, the only other single author we have in the university is Rizal. Now, Rizal is understandable. Rizal is our national hero. He wrote those novels. Every Filipino
Mm.
read them. But I said, Rizal only became mandatory with the Rizal bill post-war. Shakespeare, 1912, in UP, in what is supposed to be this really progressive Marxist red-tagged university. Why him? We're not even British colony. Hello,
Mm.
diba?
Yeah.
But when you enter the class that way, then the students are jarred.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And of course, I break it down, but I work the rest of the semester to kind of build it up. Like by the end of the semester, they must be loving him like I'm loving him. But at the beginning, you play. Teaching is a performance. We all know that.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Just like what Eileen said.
Tricks was
Yeah. Move forward or change strategies in the middle.
yeah.
Yes, that's very true. Um, yeah, actually, I was also wondering if there are any advantages you start seeing now teaching Shakespeare online. I mean, on my end, the surprising advantage I discovered is that compared to when I was teaching Shakespeare live, I would really notice some students really hide at the back of the classroom, duck behind the really good students. But now, at least with the way I'm handling my class, it feels a lot safer in the sense that some of my students can really bring out some hard questions. I mean, without the fear that I might look stupid inside the classroom. And sometimes really propose certain insights. And I remember last year I had this particular student who said that I have this insight. I'm not exactly sure if it's correct. And when she presented her idea, her reaction, my reaction was, in all my years of teaching Macbeth, I've never encountered this particular insight, and I think it's brilliant. And it really kind of makes your day, I think, or makes your semester.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think there's been great advantages. I mean, just to sound again against the tune, I love going against the tune. I know everybody's complaining about online, and of course, there are legitimate complaints about
Yes.
online. I will not dismiss those, but you're right in pointing out like one of the things that it does bring out is students are forced into sort of communicating with you one on one. And that's why I really love, I mean, the site that I showed earlier, myshakespeare.com, I really love the notebook because it allows the students to annotate the text as they're reading, just highlight and then put their little notes and questions for me or their reactions or stuff. And then I read them. It comes to me as a PDF, and then I read them. And then I see it's so interesting because then I read every student reacting to the text kind of differently in very personal ways. Now, this is not something I would have gotten live because, live is you're in the classroom, it's class discussion, and only, the people who like to raise their hands, the extroverts are, you never hear the quiet people in the back. Online forces them to be forces the quiet people in the back to suddenly share their ideas. So I think it's been great in that respect.
Yeah. I'll start reading the questions from the Q&A. I think they're starting to emerge. There is a very interesting question here, which is history necessary for students to appreciate Shakespeare?
Well, that would depend. I think that would depend on just how much you want to, what level of appreciation you're going for, and what level of student you have. So, for example, I mean, for me, I think about Sonnet 18, learning it when I was in 5th grade and just falling in love with the language. My teacher was very successful because all she wanted to show was to look at these figures of speech, hear the sound, see how the poem works. And I got it, and I got the bug, right? But it depends because, like, when I take it up, especially in for undergraduates or even graduate school, I always bring up the fact that, hey, by the way, this was written for a man by a man, ha ha ha. And so the whole entire different context comes into the reading of the play. So it really depends on where you are as a teacher. It really depends, to use the language of online learning, on the outcomes, right? It really depends on what you want this student to pick up. Okay, because that's the other danger. Do not overload with context, or at least misuse context, because this is what I can't stand with students when you ask them, okay, tell me about the history. Shakespeare was born in 1564, died in 1616, he was published by, and I'm like, yeah, and then, what does that mean? Right? So I think we have to be very selective about context, history, in the way, that is relevant to what it is we're trying to make them do. Okay. So it's that. I think there's no blanket answer, for that question.
Yeah.
It's really dependent on what you're trying to do and with what level of student.
Mhm. There's another very, very interesting question here. Can directing Shakespeare be taught to students today, given that the students have sufficient knowledge of the bard's works?
I'm not sure because, well, I'm not in the drama department, so I really don't know how one would teach directing. I mean, for me, I'm very democratic about Shakespeare. Shakespeare is free for all, and it's not like nobody owns Shakespeare. It really depends on you. If you really want to do it, if you really feel like you can take it on, then go. I'll help you if you want. If you want, I don't have to. Um, you know, it's entirely free, I think.
Mm. Here's another question. How do I teach a play by Shakespeare when we have very limited time? I want them to read the whole play, but how do we do that when we have other skills and competencies to learn? So the context is that um, the students are high school students.
Yes. Right. Yeah, high school is tough, right? And then somebody's watching over your head, this and that. And I found that Shakespeare has increasingly disappeared, except for some high schools where they still do full plays. Because I ask my students when they come to university, very few of them have actually have done whole plays. But I still would advocate for, maybe if you do excerpts, do the right excerpts. Fill in the right way, introduce them to easy texts. I swear, look at my Shakespeare.com. My students now, they've read the other plays on the site, just because it made it easier for them to read. So maybe if you do excerpts, make sure you do the right excerpts and make sure you frame the excerpts correctly. Or even if they don't read everything, fill in with video what they're not reading. I mean, I think there are things that you can do to enrich the excerpts. Yeah, but I realize it is a problem with the high school curriculum now, and this. But I think we can be very creative too, and that students have a lot of access. You'll be surprised once they're interested. My sort of digital library of Shakespeare grows because of what my students give me. Because they're so much better at searching for things and finding things, and so the key is to, I guess, get them interested, show them how to be interested, where to look, and then they just go down their own Shakespearean rabbit holes online, and encourage that. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's another one. How are prospects for outreach projects to bring Shakespeare to the grassroots?
Wow. Bring Shakespeare to the Lion, yes. I don't know. I mean, the only one I know who has, like, PETA is the only one who has a grassroots network. I mean, I don't think it's impossible. Administratively, it's hard to imagine, but the actual text and engagement with text and working with second language speakers, for example, or working with translations, working with children outside the urban settings, I think that's eminently possible. It's the administrative logistics and funding, of course, that someone has to imagine how to do this.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of anyone willing to spearhead that initiative. Yeah.
Any does Shakespeare sa Laylayan, I'm there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Here's another one. How do you think can teaching performing or theater change to be appropriated to the current learning setup, distance learning?
Okay, maybe you can answer that, Joam, because we were talking before this. Joam and I are talking before this, and I know Joam is, famous for using performance. He does those 10-minute Shakespeare festivals at UANP, and he uses performance in the classroom far more than I do. I used to, but now I don't anymore, because in my old age, I've just, decided that the only person who performs in my classroom is me. I turned diva in my old age. So you answer your question.
Okay. Well, I think on my end, ever since we shifted to teaching online, my strategies have also changed. I mean, I felt that I had to force myself to stop doing the 10-minute Shakespeare. Although at the same time, well, I have been receiving emails, of course, of people asking permission if they could still use the 10-minute scripts for performance. And I think it really helps to, at the very least, throw the lines to each other. I mean, of course, obviously there's a lot to be missed because I can no longer do blocking. And something that I've learned when I was still doing 10-minute Shakespeare was that blocking teaches kids a lot, because sometimes I get those questions. I'm standing here for a long time. What is supposed to be happening to me? And sometimes you don't notice it as you're reading the script.
There's really much to learn. There's really much to be learned by putting a play on its feet. I mean, I believe that entirely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the reason I started acting. See, I wasn't an actress as an undergrad or in high school or any of that. I wasn't in high school, if I had involvements in the theater, I was directing. See, I was asking Lucy Bailey if she was a bossy 17-year-old. That was me. But I never got into that as an undergrad. And I went straight to grad school. And it was that moment when I came back from my PhD from the States, and the internet was not really a thing. It was only beginning. I'm dating myself. So I felt so cut off from any scholarship, from any access to any, like, the journals and all kinds of materials that I could get my hands on to read and to study some more. I was cut off. Luckily, the internet came in and that changed that. But in that interim, I said to myself, how else can I study Shakespeare? And that's when I said, okay, I'll do theater. And then, of course, I did something really stupid. Alex Cortez, who I see in the audience every night, UP director. I'd just come home from grad school, just finished a PhD. I'd written on Shakespeare. And Alex was doing a production of Macbeth. I walked up to him and I said, don't you know I'm Lady Macbeth? And then he said, have you ever acted before? And I said, of course not, but I've read everything that's been written about Lady Macbeth, I promise you, in all my intellectual, pride as a young PhD. And then, of course, doing the play, I realized, oh my God, it's an entirely different set of knowledge, set of skills. And I was so stupid at it. Like, all my reading, all my scholarship meant jack shit, because I was learning the plays a new way.
Yeah.
And then it became sort of a habit because I wanted to learn more. And then, suddenly I was to double business bound. But it was really learning, trying to learn something that got me into acting. So I guess that's my personal connection to that double business bound idea. So I think performance is absolutely crucial to the learning of the plays. Some of the comments, like, people are saying in drama club, like, yes, drama club. So if the curriculum does not allow for you to have it in the classroom, then push the really, the ones you see with sparkling eyes to within drama club or extracurricular activities.
Yeah. The other thing that I could probably put in here, and I have a student who did a really wonderful thesis on it, is to try to imagine the play as in the comic book form, because it kind of challenges also the students to really choose, okay, this particular line, what's the reaction at that particular line. And sometimes just to be a little bit more specific, now that student of mine who did her thesis on Shakespeare, she just studied how, I think, 6 different graphic novels depicted the first soliloquy of Hamlet. It was so amazing, where you kind of start seeing that technically this is performance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I might add, I mean, we can think of, yeah, of course, doing it as theater as it was first meant to be, and that's performance. But you're absolutely right, and taking Shakespeare into different forms, right? The Asian Shakespeare Association, for example, through Dr. Yukari Yoshihara, runs that worldwide graphic Shakespeare competition, and in the last incarnation, there were two Filipinos there.
Yeah.
And they were, they did brilliant sort of graphic manga Shakespeare.
Yeah.
So,
Actually, one
yeah,
of those was my student. Yeah.
yeah. Another one was mine.
Wow, wonderful. Wonderful.
Anyway, yeah. So
Yeah.
there, so there are many avenues, right?
Yeah.
For doing Shakespeare. In fact, that's why I was saying, you gotta exercise your creativity, and we
Yes.
want to build creative and critical students, and students who know Shakespeare, because I was talking towards the end of my paper about how we should sort of have a Filipino brand of Shakespeare. I mean, I know we do, but it's not so solid yet, and I think that we are sometimes hampered by the fact that we are working in English. I mean, that's just my pet theory.
Mm.
And that people are not brave enough to put forth, like, more and more productions. I hope that this happens more and more in the future, right? And I'm
Mm.
seeing a lot more of that from especially the smaller, fringier, edgier groups, so that we can sort of create a more dynamic Filipino Shakespeare community. And I think
Yeah.
it starts with getting the students. You
Yeah.
have to get them while they're students.
Yes. Actually, in relation to that, there are two questions that I'm going to try to merge. There was this one question is it more advisable to teach Shakespeare in Filipino rather than English? And then there's another one that I think is sort of related, which is, can learning Shakespeare be integrated to classic Filipino literature? Is it
Well,
right to include it among
yes.
local writers?
Yes. I mean, I think so. This is another talk I gave recently, but one of the sort of interesting ways I introduce the language of Shakespeare, or at least try and elucidate it for my class, is I show them the text of Sintang Dalisay. If you're familiar with, no,
Yes.
yeah, Sintang Dalisay, which was turned into the play that Ricky has toured and this and that. But the original 1901 awit text of that, if you put it right beside the Shakespeare text, it really just looks funny. Because, of course, in Sintang Dalisay, well, Juliet's in the tomb, Romeo will kill himself, but of course, Romeo will not die until Juliet wakes up. And there are like 400 quatrains before one of them finally dies, in the most long, drawn out death scene. Because, of course, this is Filipino drama. Nobody dies immediately. 10,000 years before somebody croaks, right? So it's a big change from the Shakespeare, because when you look at it on the Shakespeare, it's like 150 lines. But in the Filipino, it's that. And then I just show them the pages, my students anyway. I say, see, look at the difference. Why is it the Filipino version of Romeo and Juliet has all of this, and then the Romeo and Juliet has that? And so we begin talking about Filipino culture, and we begin talking about like that delight in the death scene, and we begin talking about this, or talk about untranslatable, the idea of sawi na pag-ibig, which I cannot put into English in any way, but is in the center of a lot of our literature and art, right? And
Mhm.
this also why in Romeo and Juliet, which is why it is the most popular. It is what I call the pambansang play. It is the most popular play translated into a Filipino language. In different, I've seen it in Hiligaynon, I've seen it in Kapampangan, in Tagalog, in Bicol. I'm sure it's in other languages. I'm just limited by my knowledge of Filipino languages. But the Filipinos love Romeo and Juliet. Hamlet, not so much. To be or not to be.
Mm.
Filipinos, to be. Diba?
Yes. Very much so.
Of course, to be. Who play basketball in the middle of the typhoon, right? That's it.
Yeah. Make
Anyway,
TikTok videos. Yeah.
that's a whole different other conversation.
Yeah. Probably I think we have time for one very last question, and I think this is a good way to end it. Do you have some words of encouragement for pre-service teachers who might be encountering or will be teaching Shakespeare in the future?
Words of encouragement, don't stop. How's that? Don't stop. Don't give up. There are so many points of entry into Shakespeare. If you don't get the text immediately, find a text that works for you. If you don't get that, look at the graphic novels, look at the manga, look at the films, look at the theater. That's a wonderful thing about, Shakespeare. You're working with different media. So there's so many different points of entry. It's just important that you don't give up. Maybe I'll create a Shakespeare support group. I'm giving up, mom. I'll call this number. But
That would be great.
yeah, because I guarantee the rewards. The rewards will be worth that effort. Those tears will turn to Orient pearls.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I
I guess it's 7:30. We call Nikki back.
Yes.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you so much also.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Sir Joachim and Ma'am Judy. It was certainly exhilarating to listen to that discussion. I just want to share that I caught the Shakespeare bug in Sir Joachim's class back when I was in college, taking up Julius Caesar. But I never, I fell in love really with Shakespeare with Ma'am Judy's class when she really pulled Shakespeare down from the pedestal. I entered the classroom saying Shakespeare's universal and timeless, and she really no.
And I said, "You're from UANP. You're from that Opus Dei University. That's why you think like that." No, I'm just kidding.
Really like those throw that out the window, and really and when I did that, I just really fell in love with the place, and it really was so amazing to hear about to hear Dr. Judy Ake and Sir Joachim just discuss all of that. And I can also attest to the no tears Shakespeare methods. I have employed them in my classes, and somehow it gives the impression that I'm this brilliant Shakespeare teacher. So yeah, use them, and it's really, really great. So